Thank you, as always, for listening to Caleb versus Self. Today, I get to speak with Kirk from the Tomorrow I'll podcast, part of the Schemes Come True podcast network. Author, avid doodler, and prolific podcaster is what I'll say for sure. We talk about committing to a habit for your creative pursuits, finding ways to grow within that space, the nuance of separating the art from the artist, as well as a whole bunch of other stuff. It was a super awesome conversation. I had a lot of fun, especially talking about like the creative pursuit and how to get there and the grind to find your muse. You can check out Kirk at the Tomorrow Owl wherever you get your podcasts and follow them on Instagram. They also have a Patreon for the Schemes Come True podcast network. I highly suggest checking it out. A really cool lineup of different types of creative people who are just trying to pursue their passion, their journey. So again, I'd highly recommend checking it out. And I had an awesome time talking to Kirk, and I hope at this point you guys enjoy. All right, sometimes I'm not sure when it starts recording. I think it is. Cool. Kirk, thanks for hopping on, man. I appreciate the time. Author, I guess, podcaster, semi-doodler. Is that an appropriate?
Yeah, that would be. It's appropriate for sure.
Thanks
That's the best description of that I've ever heard, I think, honestly.
I stole that from you, to be fair. I think it was episode 1. You were like, yeah, I do art, I guess. Doodling is probably more appropriate.
Yeah, semi-doodler. I like that.
Well, I appreciate you hopping on. I found you obviously through Magnus. Shout out to Magnus there. But I listened to a little bit of Tomorrow I'll podcast, and the premise of the podcast essentially is you and Corey, correct?
Yep.
Are looking to go from working a regular job, I guess, and being a creative professional full time is kind of the goal of it. Right. So how's that going?
It's going. It's definitely going. It's tough, man. Like, trying to balance all of those things has been it's been really hard, especially as someone who has traditionally been kind of unmotivated. It's weird being like, I want to be a writer. It's something I've wanted to do since I was a little kid. Even like back when I thought I was going to be the next Bill Watterson. And then, I looked at my art and I was like, nope, you're not going to be Bill Watterson. So maybe you can write books. But it's always like warring with, I have all these ideas in my head, but then the motivation to put them down on paper, and like making a move and trying to stay on top of regular life has been hard, but yeah, it's so much fun. Like, Corey and I were just talking about this last night. I mean, he was in the hospital recently, and we were talking, and like, we kind of do the check-in with each other every so often. Like, are you still having fun doing this? And he's like, hell yeah, man. Like, it's work. No matter what it is, it's work, but it's so much fun. And I just recently sat down with a friend of mine who is working on like getting a coaching certification. She's like, I need you to tell me something to coach you on. And at first I was like, I need you to coach me on how to fold a fitted sheet. Like, I don't know how to do that. Can you just talk me through that process? And she's like, do you think maybe you could ask me something that would be more impactful in your life than learning how to fold a fucking fitted sheet? Yeah, that might be a good idea. So I was thinking about the show and like my writing and stuff like that, because I've kind of been a creative fallow period, I guess, recently. And she goes, well, when do you normally write? Like, what's your schedule look like? And I said, well, I schedule out my day, but I teach during the day, and I try to block off an hour at the end, in the evening to write. And she goes, well, when do you feel most productive? Like, when do you feel most energized and creative? And I'm like, well, first thing in the morning. And she's like, so what do you do first thing in the morning? I'm like, well, normally I go into school and I plan the day. She goes, just why not write during that time instead? Like, holy shit, you're right. So she helped me set up a plan, and I've done more writing in the last 2 weeks than I had done in like the last 2 months. So sometimes, it's a matter of just tweaking what you got going and having that outside perspective to help with that. And
how helpful is it there to have somebody like Corey to still check in and say, hey, are you still having fun? Are you still like motivated to do this?
It's really helpful. Like, that's one of the things that has come out of doing the podcast, that having that accountability piece whether it's Corey or it's like, talking to Magnus every so often. He's like, "Hey, how's the writing going?" And I'm like, "Shit, I haven't done any writing in a while. What am I supposed to tell him?" Like, now having that kind of support network has been so helpful to getting more stuff out there. Like, I participated in NYC Midnight's short story challenge this year,
Mm-hmm.
and it's really cool. They've been around for, I think it's 15 years at this point. But the first round, they give you a setting, a character, and some kind of like genre, and you have a week to write a story of 2,500 words. And then the next round, they give you 3 days to write. If you pass through, they give you 3 days to write a story of 2,000 words, and then they winnow it down until it's like 2 people, and they have 24 hours to kick out a 1,000-word story or whatever. And my cousin was the one who told me about it, and he helped like edit, and I bounced the story off of him a couple of times over the course of the week. And so just having people to talk about those creative things with has been super helpful. I mean, I got to give a lot of credit to my friend Chuck, who actually I think you should talk to too. If you want to, I would have to fill you in on him. He doesn't really have a huge social media presence.
Sure.
But he and I painted houses together, and he has a wild life story that he's been telling me in bits and pieces over the years. And at one point I was like, dude, you should just write this down, like write a book. And in his process of like working through that, it kind of reinvigorated my creative fire. And that's part of where like Tomorrow Owl came from. Like the idea that there are so many people out there who want to do creative things, but they don't know the path. And I mean, it's not like Corey and I are experts by any means, but
sure,
it's been fun kind of fumbling along that path. And the best part of it has been the conversations that we've had with people, because you learn so much. And I mean, I'm sure you figured this out. You learn so much from people that you would never have talked to by sitting down and asking them about like what they're passionate about. And I think moving forward, one of the goals of the network, I think, is exactly that. It's to use the network to bring people together, to like connect different creative people with each other, with the sharing knowledge. Basically, I know one of our guests is a musician named Matt Oldegus, and one of the things that he said when we interviewed him that it just really resonated with me was, when you think competition, instead think collaboration. And it's amazing what switching your mindset on that can do. I remember when we first started our storytelling show, I had like come up with a name for it and like put all this stuff together, and I was putting our link tree together for that show, and I was just doing some basic Google searching to see like what popped up where. And there was another storytelling show that somebody had released on iTunes or whatever with a name that was almost identical. And then I went and looked, and I'm like, the name is almost identical. The description of the podcast is almost identical. I got super pissed. Like, Corey and I were living together at that time. It's like, Corey, you got to get in here. You got to see this. This is ridiculous. Like, right. So angry. I like went and double checked. It's like, our show came out, 3 weeks before this. Like, clearly, I mean, definitely parallel thinking is a thing, but I was just so angry. And then I stopped and I thought about it, and I was like, okay, what can I do? Like, I can either go and try to put this person on blast, or I can reach out to them. And I was like, wait a minute. No. Let me listen to what they do. And their show is called, what the hell is it? I think it's Stories from the In-Between, or Stories from In-Between. I'll have to pull up the link to their podcast. But I reached out to them. I said, hey, as I was, Googling stuff about our show, results for your show came up. And it looks like we do similar things. If you don't mind, like, I've listened to your stuff. I'm enjoying it. Give our stuff a listen. And if you like it, could you promote us? I'm planning on talking up your show on our stuff. We don't have a huge following, but it could be helpful to you just to get some extra ears on what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And they reached out and they were very positive about it. So I don't know. It was one of those times where it definitely reinforced to me that collaboration, is way better of a choice than competition sometimes. It's just having the presence of mind to remember that. And I think had that not gone as positively as it did, I might not have that same perspective, or might not be as easy now to kind of think that way. But I'm really glad we did it. Like, I'm glad that I took that second to cool off and think about what would be more beneficial rather than just kind of giving into the feeling of being pissed.
Yeah. So when it comes to collaboration and when it comes to creative types, there seems to be an overlap for creatives to tend to want to collaborate as well because, well, actually, I don't know why. From your perspective, what do you think it is about specifically collaboration that allows people who do creative activities where, I don't know, it feels like it lends naturally to itself to be a bit more collaborative?
Mm-hmm.
Is there something there that I'm missing maybe? Like, what is it that allows those type of people, you, for example, and Corey, to collaborate, to do things like that?
I think it's like it creates this feedback loop is what happens, because you know how like when you're talking to somebody and they're excited about an idea, it's hard if it's, something you're interested in, it's also hard not to be excited about that idea. So I think that's what it is. I think like Corey would talk to me about a new project that he's working on, and my brain, like as he's describing something, like my brain is like, oh, that's really cool. This reminds me of this thing, or this reminds me of this thing that I'm working on. Or have you ever considered looking at it in this way? Like he
It's
has a,
infectious, right?
yeah, exactly. And I think it's basically, it turns into this very positive feedback loop where you're excited about your idea, they're excited about their idea. You can find some crossover there, but there's like some magic in talking about the projects that you're working on, because people naturally kind of want to give feedback on things, or they
Mm-hmm.
want to make connections to the things that you're talking about. And you find some really cool ideas out of the connections that people make. And I think it just kind of, it's like, oh, I never thought about that. This is like, I can take the story in this direction. So uh, the story I wrote for that short story contest is called Soup of the Day. And it's actually based on one of those little postcards. I don't know if I actually posted the story, that one on Instagram, but the premise originally was a guy wakes up one day and he finds that his mind, he has a like one way telepathic connection to one person.
I
But the
don't think
problem
you
is,
posted that one.
okay, well, the problem is the person he's telepathically connected to, the only thing he thinks about is soup. That's it. All day long, soup. And it starts to very quickly drive, the recipient of all of these soup images insane. And so when I got my prompt for the short story contest, it was drama, podiatrist, and vacation. And so I was like, oh, this is easy. Soup and feet. Those are the only two things he thinks about. Or the only thing he thinks about is soup because he's podiatry all day and it's miserable. And so I like kind of threw a draft together, and then I was talking to my cousin about it, and he goes, here's what you do. He's like, don't just do soup. It's like juxtapose soup and feet together because that's disgusting. I'm like, yeah, you're right. It is disgusting. And that would definitely, give it would definitely make sense that the person would go crazy very quickly when you're seeing shrimp bisque in your head and then somebody's corns. Like,
Oh, dude.
yeah, I mean, so, I wrote, I bounced around versions and stuff like that. And then in talking with my cousin, it kind of, he writes as well. And so we kind of just kept going, like trying to follow this crazy train of thought to its illogical end, but what would be the most interesting end, basically.
Yeah.
And we got into some very like weird Black Mirror territory, thinking about, okay, maybe it's not a psychic connection, maybe it's very narrow band advertising. And what the guy with the psychic connection, what he actually is doing is they're testing advertising, and he hates his job. So now he's just trying to drive people nuts. So the story, unfortunately, like we could not go that far in 2,500 words, but
Right.
I'm going to do a second draft of it that expands kind of the world that I was able to tell in 2,500 words. And it's just fun to like it's fun to bounce those ideas off of people. One of my favorite parts of the story actually came out of another conversation with my cousin. We were talking about how like the big payoff in the contest version was the guy tracks down the podiatrist and he's going to basically interrogate him to find out like why me, what the hell, like what's going on.
Right.
And he's like like maybe he could waterboard him. Like, okay. And he's like, no, wait a minute. What if he puts a sock on his face and waterboards him with soup? And I'm like, okay, you can do that. And like, what kind of soup? And then my cousin's like, no. Here's what you do. You don't do soup. You do jambalaya, which is kind of like soup, but not really soup. And he's like, you get to have your Curb Your Enthusiasm moment where the podiatrist at the last minute is like, well, jambalaya technically isn't soup, And it just pushes the dude over the edge to murder. So, I mean, we never would have gotten to that place on my own. It was coming through collaboration with my cousin. Shout out to Peter. That led to that wild and very fun to write story. And like, I'm definitely going to flesh out the world of that now that that round of the contest is over. So
cool. Well, I mean, my first reaction to that is what if that happens, that narrow band advertising, because you thought, like, could you imagine if you thought something random and that's it? You've got advertising for that random thought forever. Mm-hmm. That would be, that I feel like that world in and of itself, there's so much there, I'm sure, for you to like expand upon. But that's
I would go insane very quickly. I would go insane, I think, with some of the stuff that crosses my mind if I got ads immediately. I mean, it's always, I don't know about you, but I find it interesting to see how quickly my Google searches end up being my Instagram ads. Right. And then it's like, what the hell was I searching? What did I look at that they think I want these products?
Right. If they had access to your random thoughts and did advertising based on that, oh geez, could you imagine?
I'd lose my mind. I think I would definitely lose my mind so quickly. Like it would just be debilitating because, I mean, even I would get into a car accident because you'd get a random ad in your brain as you're driving and you're like, why the hell would it? And then, you just slam into the back of somebody on the highway.
You would just have a world of people who would constantly become unreasonably angry because they just got an ad for something that they hate based on a random thought they had 5 weeks ago or something. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
Well, let me go back to the coach there because a lot of sometimes, or I shouldn't say a lot, but sometimes what you guys talk about on your podcast is like chasing the muse and how to keep getting that inspiration. What is it or how is it that you try to conjure the muse, if you will, for yourself in your writings?
I think it's, a great book for this, honestly. And I finally convinced Corey to read it, is The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield.
Yep.
And he talks a lot about, for anybody that's going to do anything in life that's challenging, you can apply kind of the advice in that book to basically anything, whether it's weight loss, it's writing, it's painting, whatever. One of the biggest things is having a consistent time every day. And that's like in talking with my friend who's the coach, like setting that 6 a.m. to 7 a.m. time aside. And that's the time that I write pretty much like Monday through Friday. That's the time that I write. And Pressfield talks about if you're going to do it, you need to treat it like a job. So you show up every day at this time, you work for your, specified period of time. And then, you've done your work for the day. It could be garbage. He's like, but you've still shown up and done your work. And that's been so it's one of those things like, I don't know about you. This is how I get sometimes where like I read something like The War of Art and I'm super energized. I'm like, yeah, I'm doing this. And then over time it kind of starts to fade a little bit. Like, oh, I missed a couple of days here and I'll get back to it, whatever. And then it goes away. And then I have to like reread the book or find another source of like inspiration like that, or sit down and do the coaching session to get back on track. So I think that accountability piece, like my friend has been checking in with me. Doing the podcast has also kind of helped keep me accountable. I think accountability and then scheduling out that time every day to treat it like a job, essentially, I think has been the best way to kind of chase the muse, because his thing in that book is that the muse recognizes when you're doing work. And when you put in the work, that's when the muse turns up. So whether you believe in it in like his sense, where it's, like you're tuning in a radio to the right frequency and you only get there by putting the time and the effort in, which I love that image. Or you think more in the kind of Malcolm Gladwell sense, where you've put the 10,000 hours in and that's how you've become a master of your craft. That's, it's consistency. It's just doing the work. Like, I know, it's stupid, but Nike nailed it on the head when they said, just do it. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what it boils down to. You got to show up. And again, even if it's trash, you got to show up. But
that's how my dad is. So I don't know if you can see right here, this painting right behind me is my father's work, and he's been an
that's
artist
awesome.
for since before I was born. So it's been 30 years plus. And that was his always thing was just keep going. Just do it. Just keep going. Like, don't stop just because you think it's bad. Do it again. Keep pushing that envelope as much as possible. And I wonder how much of the muse, if you will, sprinkles in those little breadcrumbs. The more you do that, the more you make that habit, the more you commit to that exercise. That here's a nugget right here. Here's a crumble. And then all of a sudden you've got your soup feet story, or your whatever it is that you're chasing.
Yeah, and I think it's fun to, like, I don't know. I am a odd mix of neuroscience and, for lack of a better term, the woo-woo stuff, where you show up, the muse shows up. But like, from a neurological standpoint, I think it makes sense, because the more you activate a pathway in your brain, the stronger like that pathway becomes, and then the more like connections it makes. So definitely, like, building that habit is that kind of brain science part. But I don't know, like, when you're in that flow state, when the writing is going, it really doesn't feel like it's coming from my brain. It feels like, someone's telling me a story and I'm just writing it down. And that's such a cool feeling. And I mean, I think that's, it's, you chase it, but that's when you get your best work, if you're sitting there and you've been hammering on, a sentence or a paragraph, or like, fuck, this is, I can't get the wording on this right. And all of a sudden it's just kind of coming out of you. It's pretty damn cool.
Yeah. I feel like that next step, right? You're building that habit and you're in that zone, right? And the next step to that muse, if you will, is something that I picture with Muhammad Ali. One of the things he used to say, or it might have been Mike Tyson, I can't remember. One of them would say, I don't count push-ups until it starts to hurt. And that's when you're getting that next level of whatever it is that you're looking for. So like, you commit, you do your hour, but your hour sometimes runs over because you're hitting a pace. You're all of a sudden it's coming, and you're going to push well past that hour because you're in that zone finally. Does it work somewhat like that for you?
Sort of. There are some days where I'm definitely like, get to the end of the hour and I'm like, thank God it's the end of the hour. And there are other days where it's definitely, you just want to keep going. I tried and I found some success with, I don't know why they call it this, but it's the Pomodoro technique, where you set a timer for 25 minutes and you do one task for 25 minutes. And then you have 5 minutes, you take 5 minutes off, so you have your half hour, and then you go back to that task or a new task for another 25 minutes. And you just keep doing your work and your breaks in these chunks. And I found a lot of success in that. There are definitely times where I like look down at my timer and I'm like, oh God, I'm only 8 minutes in. I have, this much time left until I get my break. But a lot of the time, like, the timer goes off. I'm like, holy shit, it's been 25 minutes. Yeah. There's a comedian named Ari Shafir who is an absolute lunatic, but there was something that he said that really stuck with me a couple of years ago, where no matter what he's doing, he writes every day, but he forces himself to write for 10 minutes. Like, 10 minutes is not that long. And he goes, if you suffer through your 10 minutes, at least you did 10 minutes. But 90% of the time, you're going to find that once you hit that 10-minute mark, you want to keep going anyway. So that's what it is. It's like getting in there, doing the work, and you get to that point where you're tired or it hurts, and you're like, this is when the actual work happens. This is when the growth happens. So that's been helpful to me too. Like, it's 10 minutes. I can do that.
Right. Well, you say that, but then 8 minutes in, you're like, man.
Yep. But then it's only 2 more
pushing
minutes.
Through that boundary. It's just pushing through that little obstacle, if you will, whether it's that mental writer's block or whether it's, like you said, restructuring a sentence where at some point you want to throw, your pen at the wall because you can't figure out how to structure it properly or find the right words to use.
One of the best things I've done for myself in terms of writing and perfectionism and stuff like that has been to, when I realize that's what I'm doing, or I'm like, I hit a sentence and I just put in parentheses after it, this wording sucks, come back and fix it later. Like, so I can have that moment of frustration, and then it's like, but I know I'm going to come back. And it definitely has helped me push through those moments of frustration. Like, acknowledge it, move through it, and then move on, because you have more work to do.
Well, that's part of the problem with being a perfectionist, isn't it? Like, you want to get that structure perfect before you move on to the next sentence. But if you do that, you spend in this case, your 25 minutes trying to perfect one sentence, you've kind of, or you can lose that muse or that creative inspiration. So as someone who does that, I know writing is like, I feel like of the 2 or 3 times I've tried it, 80% of it is going back and rereading and redoing it all over again. How do you, as someone who wants it to be perfect, go through that type of a process where you rewrite or you re-edit?
I think it's a matter of getting to the point where, what the hell? What's the expression? I think it's, don't let perfectionism stand in the way of good enough. Because no matter what, and I mean, a lot of that, or like being okay with that, honestly has come out of listening to comedians talk about their process. Like, I am a huge podcast nerd, and the thing that I hear over and over from any number of the comedians who talk about what they do is that, you get your bit to like 80%, and then you get it out there, and you may down the line, like, you put it on a special, you put it on a CD, whatever, and you find a month, 2 months after you've released the material, like, shit, I have a better ending for that. I have a better tag for that, whatever. And then, like, you just got to let it go. Like, that's saying to you basically is that you have good ideas. Now take that and apply it to new things. And so, I don't know. I mean, people give Stephen King a lot of shit about endings, but endings are so hard to get right. And you could spend your entire life trying to craft the perfect ending. I mean, not to let him off the hook or other writers off the hook for garbage endings when they have them, but like, I can understand that. Like, you're ready to release something. Like, you just need to let it go sometimes. I think Magnus had said something to this effect to Corey and I. Like, in order to release more work, you have to release work. Mm-hmm. So you can't we don't have the luxury of being Leonard Cohen and hammering away on Hallelujah for 20 years, like, recording God knows how many versions of that song and still not getting it right, or in his opinion, getting it right before he died. Like, we just, we can't do that. We're not super famous musicians. So,
well, part of it too is when you release whatever it is that you're working on, whether it's, writing or painting, or in this case, conversations, podcasting, right? Without releasing it and hearing the criticism as well, how can you recognize that growth? How can you find, in your example, when you say, a comedian goes back and says, oh, I would have had a better one for that. To me, that's a signal of growth. You've identified something to get better at, and now you can go and get better at it.
That's always been my thing with, like, when I ask people to read my stuff, like, please don't tell me that it's good. Like, that doesn't help me at all. Like, tell me if it sucks, but I need you to tell me why. Like, tell me give me something that you liked, but more importantly, tell me something that you disliked or you were confused about, because those are the places where I need to do work.
Yeah.
And that's been really helpful. For anybody that also is trying to get into doing like creative projects or whatever, there's a really great podcast called Start With This that the creators of Welcome to Night Vale have put on, where they basically go through their creative process and they give it to you step by step. And they give you a little, like, every week that they release it, there's an assignment of something to consume and then an assignment of something to create. And that's been I'll be honest, I've specifically been avoiding listening to it because it's like, I know this will keep me accountable.
Right.
It will add more stuff to my plate. So I've kind of avoided listening to it regularly, but they give such great advice. I just need to bite the bullet and do it because the stuff that they're asking you to do doesn't take that long. It's just one of those, what, like Stephen Pressfield calls it, resistance. It's basically his theory is that your ego doesn't want you to change. Your ego is happy with you the way you are because it basically runs your life. And when you try to change, when you try to do something positive in your life or something creative, your ego's like, what the hell, man? Like, I don't want to change. I don't want to do this. So it comes up with any number of distractions or, even if it's productive procrastination, it throws all of these obstacles in your way to keep you from changing. And so the whole first section of The War of Art is identifying and recognizing resistance. So he's basically saying, like, here's all the sources, here's all the stuff that's going to get in your way, and you'll be surprised at how creative your ego becomes to stop itself from changing. And then, like, the next section is basically do the work. Like, that's where he says schedule a time, treat it like a job, and eventually you'll kind of conquer your ego. And it's like when you've conquered your ego or when you can kind of control that, that's when the muse shows up. So I really like, again, the structure of that book. Like, the first one is, identifying the problems and recognizing the problems. Here's how you deal with them. Here are the rewards. So check it out again, and then start with this. I need to start listening to it again because it's going to help.
Right. Well, the one thing that I really like on your Instagram is the postcard stories. And I imagine, and I'm guessing, the idea there is to try to create a story in as little space as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And I really like the invisible dude one where he's like testing the waters. I'm like, I was worried about my torso because my heart might stop, but it worked out. And hopefully tomorrow I'll just disappear altogether.
Yeah.
Do you start creating these short stories on postcards, and then as time goes on, do you just like kind of like with the soup thing, do you extrapolate like a potentially a bigger world or a bigger story with the ones that you really like?
For some of them, yes. So some
Okay.
of them are like, hold on just a second. Sorry.
Sure.
Didn't realize my computer wasn't plugged in.
No worries, man.
Some of them start as like the postcard story is the germ of an idea that becomes a bigger story, and others are actually where I have a bigger narrative planned, and I want to come up with a succinct, almost like it's an elevator pitch version of the story. So the soup of the day story came out of like a postcard originally. I didn't have any idea of like where it was going to go really, and I'm trying to think of. There's one that I sent, and I'm not sure if it's on there either. I got to go back and look what's on the Instagram now. There's one that I sent out to a friend of mine who actually gave me a whole ration of shit about saying Donuts Delight were the best donuts in Rochester because he's like, you got to have Ridge Donuts, man. What's wrong with you? About this necromancery weird character that comes kind of crawling along the roads, and it's like the postcard is like a
with all the hands.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a warning, it's like a bedtime story kind of thing.
Yep.
And I got in trouble for sending that to him because the postcards don't have a return address on them, and that showed up at his house, and his fiance read it before, and she's like, I guess she texted him at work or called him at work. It's like, somebody's threatening you. I don't know what's going on. Like, and I'm like, oh no. But
that's funny though.
Yeah. But that little snippet came out of something I want to turn into a much larger story. Like the image of that character, I want to perpetuate in other things that I've written. And there's a whole backstory there that goes with that guy with all of his hands. So it just kind of depends on what sparks my brain. And part of it too, some of those have come out of going back through old journals where I've scribbled down ideas. I'm like, what the hell? There's no context for this. I don't know what this line means. So like something that could have turned into like that idea, like the original idea that I wrote down probably has nothing to do with what it ended up becoming because I didn't flesh it out enough. I'm like, this sentence sounds cool. I must write it down right now. So
did the Tomb City come out of a postcard situation, or is that more of a committed effort to write that full thing?
So that story came out of it was not a postcard story originally. I wrote the original version of that, I don't know, 5 years ago, maybe more at this point. It came out of the idea of well, I'll be honest.
Sure.
I may or may not have consumed some fungus and had some fungal ideas. But it basically, I was fixated on this image of thinking about love in terms of a graveyard, or like the idea of the heart in terms of a graveyard, and how it's okay to have more than one body buried in the graveyard. Essentially, like thinking about the capacity for love is much greater than for just one person. So if just because you love somebody doesn't mean you can't love someone else. And for whatever reason in my brain, it was like, yeah, it's like having multiple bodies buried somewhere, which saying that out loud sounds really creepy. But eventually that turned into this idea of the tomb city, of having these multiple tombs, although it doesn't, the tombs are for one person, and that it came from that idea of like, thinking of the love in the graveyard of your heart. So that's where that idea started. And I like wrote a couple of different versions of it. And even the recorded version is different from the one that's in that little zine that I made, because as Corey was reading it out loud, I was like, wow, that wording sounds so clunky.
Right.
And it definitely, like, the version he recorded is a much more streamlined version. I can definitely tell going back and rereading it. It's like I was reading a lot of Stephen King and a lot of Lovecraft this time, because there's so much, it's so wordy. It was so freaking wordy. It's funny. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
It's funny, like some of those stories, especially some of the early things that I wrote, like I can definitely identify who I was reading or who I was listening to at that time, because it seeps into my writing. So I still read a lot. One of the best pieces of advice that anybody who wants to write can do is to read. I mean, it comes straight from Stephen King. He's like, if you want to be a good writer, you have to read a lot. And if you want to be a good reader, you have to write a lot. So
who are you reading?
I do that, but I try to distance myself, or I try not to read. I have like a stack of books, but it's not the same author all in a row, because that's how like it ends up in your writing.
Who are you reading today, and who are the authors that you're like, these are the ones that you like the best? The authors. I mean, you said Stephen King, I think, twice now, so I imagine he's somewhere on the list, right?
Oh, for sure. I mean, Stephen King definitely, as a kid, in my teens or whatever, I just devoured his books. And there's a story that I wrote that I don't think exists anywhere right now, at least, that I distinctly remember. I was like cleaning my room or something, and the story started to like pop into my head wholesale. And it was like somebody was telling it to me, and I was like, this, for whatever reason, it feels like Stephen King is telling me a story. I'm like, and if Stephen King is telling me a story, I better fucking write it down. So
right.
I ended up, I wrote it, and I need to go back and revisit it. It's basically just a story about writer's block, where a guy writes a story, doesn't finish it, throws it in the trash, and in the middle of the night, the main character starts talking to him, being like, why the hell did you throw me away? Like, is this what you feel about, like, why would you create me only not to finish me? So I need to come back and revisit that for sure. I think there's some fertile ground there for a lot of different things, but Stephen King's up there.
Lovecraft as well.
Lovecraft for sure. I am a big fan of horror in general. Like a good, especially short story, good short horror story is one of my favorite things to read. Lovecraft, of course, has a very complicated I don't know what the right word was. I mean, he was a super racist, and it comes out in his writing. But the idea is like the cosmic horror piece is great. The rest of his stuff, not so much. But just the idea of that, of thinking of these things that are so alien to us that we can't comprehend them, always is something that I like to play with. But the people that really that I've read a lot recently that kind of have shaped my writing, I would say David Mitchell. He wrote Cloud Atlas. He's got a lot of other great books like The Bone Clocks, and Slade House is one of my favorites. Haruki Murakami, who is a Japanese artist or a Japanese writer, who the first time I read one of his books, I felt like I got done, and it was like that feeling when you wake up from a fever dream where you're just like, I don't understand how I ended up here.
Right.
And I was just, I was enthralled. I've read, I think, almost everything that he's written. And it's one of the cool things, like, as you read through an artist's body of work, you start to realize, like, you see their tricks. And you also realize, like, Mitchell, especially Mitchell and Murakami. There's another guy named Stephen Millhauser who is just like the king of short stories. I think he wrote. Have you ever seen The Illusionist? That movie.
Yes.
Okay, so he wrote the short story that became The Illusionist. He's just a master of the short story. Like, his stuff is ridiculous. But in reading through a bunch of, like, a body of work from somebody, people that when I first read their stuff, like Mitchell and Murakami, like, I'll never be this good. I should just quit now. Like, I will never write a sentence this good. Why am I even bothering? And then you go back and read early stuff, and you're like, well, this is still better than anything I've ever written, but it's not as good as the stuff that came later.
Yeah.
Like, so, it's inspiring, because it's like, shit, they weren't always as good as the first book that I read by them. So I can get there. Like, it's going to take a lot of work, but I can get there. So those three guys, Mitchell, Murakami, Millhauser, are huge. Recently, I've really gotten into Ted Chiang. He wrote The Story of Your Life, which is basically the movie Arrival.
Okay.
And he, like, that guy writes a sentence like he's making a samurai sword. With Stephen King, he'll sort of bludgeon you with description. I mean, again, love Stephen King. I will read so much Stephen King, and it gets the point across. But, like, what Stephen King does in a paragraph, Ted Chiang does in a sentence. It's insane reading how, like, clean his writing is. And he's very in the kind of speculative fiction, heavily grounded in science world. So all of his stories, they have an element of, like, fantasy and surrealism to them, but they all come from a place of possibility. One of my favorite things that he wrote is called The Merchant and the Alchemist's Gate. And while, I mean, I love the story, LeVar Burton reads it on his podcast, LeVar Burton Reads, and I've listened to it like 4 times. It's an hour and a half long, and it's a story about time travel that's told like it's from the Arabian Nights, basically. It's incredible. And just the nesting of the different things, and then the science that actually makes sense behind it, of how you can influence your own time loop. It's wild. Absolutely wild.
So sure, I've got to listen to that
guys.
one.
Yeah. But yeah, I got a big old stack. I read over the summer, Chuck Palahniuk released a book called Consider This, which is just a manual. Really, it's a manual for writers. And it is filled with so much awesome practical advice. Like, if you want to get into writing, get that book. It's so good. And plus, it's full of ridiculous, like, Chuck Palahniuk book tour stories, where he talks about getting in trouble with the guy that wrote 127 Hours, because at a certain point, Palahniuk was tired of signing people's body parts for them to go get tattooed. Mm-hmm. So he just bought a bunch of fake limbs from China and then signed all of those, and he would send them ahead of him on his book tour. And one year he just happened to be following Aaron Ralston, or whatever the guy's name is, on the book tour, and his limbs showed up first. and the Borders employees or whatever just assumed they belonged to
Oh,
Ralston. And then so like they're like, what do you want us to do with these? And of course, it's an arm and it says Chuck Palahniuk on it. And he's like, yeah, that guy thinks I'm an asshole.
Well, I definitely could see how that would come across that way. Chuck
Yeah,
is the one who wrote Fight Club, correct?
Yep, he wrote Fight Club, Choke.
Yep.
One of the ones that I really, really enjoyed that he wrote that I read recently was called Haunted, where it's like these people try to, under the guise of like having a writer's retreat, they basically try to one up each other with traumatic stories. It's wild.
Okay.
It's worth a read for sure.
So
It's
going
very
back to
uncomfortable at times, but it's worth a read.
Yeah. Going back to some of the stuff you were talking about earlier, one of the things you had mentioned was Lovecraft and his blatant racism.
Mm-hmm.
There's a large debate going on, and I'm curious to see if you have any opinion on it, but are you allowed to separate an artist from whatever shitty things they may or may not do? Like, for example, and I haven't seen it yet, but I believe there's a documentary out about who is it? Woody Allen, I think.
Mm-hmm.
About some of those
Yeah.
situations, if you will. I'll just leave it at that because I haven't seen the whole thing. But
Right.
there's a lot of people who want to, whatever you want to call it, cancel or get rid of an
Mm-hmm.
artist's work based on maybe some of the horrible things that they've done. Are you allowed to separate an artist from themselves at times?
I feel like it's a case by case basis. And I know that's not like a satisfactory answer, but one of the things that I talk about a lot, or I think about a lot with my friends and just in life in general, is that I think we, for whatever reason, I don't know if it's just our monkey brains, but we, especially in groups, tend to think in black and white and just avoid at all costs any kind of nuance. So I think you kind of have to evaluate things, especially that separating the art from the artist, on a case by case basis. Like if somebody is using their art essentially as a guise or as a vehicle for their predatory or abusive like behavior, I think that would definitely be a case where you can't really separate the two things. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know enough about any particular person's case to speak on anyone specifically. But like the first thing that pops in my head is like Harvey Weinstein, like using your platform and like your creative, I don't know, power or whatever, basically to manipulate and abuse people. I feel like you get rid of that dude wholesale. But then at the same time, like I still watch Quentin Tarantino movies, so it's hard to hard to do that. I think case by case is the best way that I've found to approach it. I mean, Lovecraft, like one of the things that I didn't know this until recently, and it makes total sense. All of his stuff is in the public domain. So that's why you find like 75 different editions of his story somewhere. But that also means you can reinterpret and you can take his stuff and rewrite it however you see fit. So if you wanted to rewrite or re-release versions of his things without the blatant racism, because it's not like it's integral to the story. Like I feel like you couldn't take Huck Finn and pull the racism out of Huck Finn and have it be the same story that it was, like have the same impact that it had.
Right.
But you can definitely take the racism out of Lovecraft and the cosmic horror is still there.
Yeah, so that's a good point.
I think like a lot of it, again, it just has to do with nuance and shades of gray. Like I read Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. That story would never get published today. Not in a million years. I don't know if you're familiar at all. It is like, I don't know how the hell this dude wrote it, because it's basically the story of a pedophile. The main character is a pedophile and it's all about him and what he does. And I'm like, how do you, I mean, I've abandoned stories because I hate the main character. Like, how would you write something with a guy this deplorable? Mm-hmm. And it's so well written at times, like you forget. You're like, wait a minute, this guy's a child molester. Why the fuck am I still interested in his story? So I don't know. Like, to see, it's weird. I don't like talking about Lolita that much, just because it's hard not to fall into the trap of uh, again, I guess, separating even the art of that story from the deplorable main character. Like, it's an incredibly well written book, but it's about a pedophile. So
right.
I don't know, but I feel like you need to have that realism, I think, in art. I think that stuff needs to be there. You can't just wholesale get rid of it because it makes people uncomfortable. I mean, I'm totally fine with, I get it. You need to be compassionate about people's trauma, and I understand the purpose of content warnings, like the second Tales from the In-Between story, or maybe it was the third one. There's domestic violence in it, and so we put a content warning on the episode for that reason. But just thinking about this the other day, like, as an artist, or not an artist, God, as a writer, the best stories that I've written start with a grain of truth. They start with some story or some idea that's true, and then you kind of layer on the fiction like it's a pearl. And a lot of the truth about life is not pretty. It's not, it's not all sunshine and rainbows, and sometimes it is traumatic. Mm-hmm. And I want to be able to explore that stuff, but still be compassionate about what, like, people's sensitivities and stuff like that. So it's a really hard line to walk. And again, it just comes down to nuance and being willing to talk to people and to listen to what they have to say and take their feedback. I think, again, you got to have nuance. Too many people, or too often, we just default into that black and white mindset, and it doesn't allow for any conversation. And then people just remain ignorant of each other because we fall into that us versus them mentality too easily.
Yeah, and unfortunately, ignorance then breeds hatred and so on and so forth. So I'm a fan of the shades of gray and nuance because, yeah, you're right. You have to be able to separate and identify what things mean to you as a person and how you can, whether it's navigate those avenues properly or have those conversations properly is extremely important.
Yep. I mean, and as if something that you created there's a net negative to it, I guess, then as a artist or a writer or whatever, you also have to be willing to put something aside. Like, you and I were talking earlier about a short story that I wrote, that at the time I was like, this ideas in my head, and it, like, the story came to me essentially wholesale, and I wrote it down and I was really proud of it. And then I had a couple people read it, unfortunately, after it ended up in a small literary magazine, and like, yeah, you realize what this story is actually about, right? And I was like, no. And they told me, and I'm like, oh shit. Yep, you're right. I didn't even think about, like, never thought about it in the context that people were reading it, I guess, until somebody told me, and it's just like, yeah, maybe I need to take this one. Like, it just needs to go away.
Gotcha.
So, I mean, it's not like, I'm not ashamed that I wrote it, but it's just one of those things. It's important to get feedback. Mm-hmm. It's important to talk to people about your ideas and, like, the things that you write and stuff before you release them. And maybe, like, if I had talked to people beforehand, the story would still exist, just in a different form. It's not like I would have abandoned the idea completely, but unfortunately, the way, as a younger, more inexperienced writer, like, the way that the execution was bad. And I'll be 100% honest. It did not, what I was trying to accomplish, the story did not accomplish, I guess is the way to put it. So, you got to be willing to, and to quote Stephen King, you got to be willing to kill your darlings, because, everything you make is not going to be amazing, even if you think it is.
Right. And there's going to be those times where you're going to have whatever your art form is, there's going to be those times where you think it's perfect and not realize after the fact that, there's a couple in there that, whether it's, brush strokes that were wrong, or words that were wrong, or whatever that medium is, you have to go back and acknowledge that. So I got one last one for you. I've taken up a whole bunch of your time, but one last one. Going
I've had a
back
lot
to
of fun.
some
I
of
appreciate it.
going back to the authors you were talking about, specifically, you were looking at, certain works of theirs, and you're like, I'm never going to be this good. I should quit now.
Mm-hmm.
How is it? Because I've read a lot of that as well, not just in writing, but in most spaces, this thought of I'm never going to be that good. I should just quit.
Mm-hmm.
How do you make sure that you take into context comparing yourself to yesterday or last month or last year, as opposed to comparing yourself to a million time award winning XYZ, fill in the blank of all the accolades type of person?
Mm-hmm.
How do you avoid that trap?
I think it's a matter. I think one of the best ways to do that is read early works by the people that you admire, because again, it's like the first book that David Mitchell wrote. I think it's called Revolution 9 or something like that, and it's still better than anything that I've written to date. 100%. Like, he deserves all the praise and accolades, but you can see where he's trying to do things and he's not quite successful, that are like stuff that he tries in that book where he's not quite successful. He's really successful with it in Cloud Atlas. So it's just like, if you admire somebody, I say try to read or consume as much of their stuff as you can, especially the early stuff, because you'll see kind of the progression there. You'll see like where the brushstroke wasn't right the first time, and then later on you can see where it's perfect. Like, or where, in writing, they took a page or a chapter to tell something that later on they're able to convey in a sentence. I think that's important. I think it's just always recognizing that growth. There is a really, really great quote from Ira Glass from This American Life. I have a poster of it in my classroom, actually, where he talks about the reason that you get into a creative endeavor is because you have killer taste. And when you first start writing, he talks about in the context of writing, when you first start writing, you don't like your work because it does not measure up to your taste. And people quit because of that. Like, I'll admit it, that's the reason I stopped drawing or trying to get better at drawing, because I just was too frustrated that the image I had in my head never ended up on the paper. I remember being 10 years old and I was like, I'm going to draw a tiger. And then I drew the tiger and I'm like, this looks like shit. And I'm,
right.
I'm not drawing a tiger again. But he said that it's only through pushing through that you're going to get better. And it's understanding that, like, the reason your work disappoints you is because you have such high standards. You have high expectations for yourself. So you need to, just like Pressfield was saying, you need to show up and do the work, because it's only through doing the work that you're going to improve. I mean, it's kind of stupid. It's not stupid, but like, I don't know, anybody who's ever lifted weights, when you first start lifting weights, if you're going to do squats or dumbbell curls or whatever, you're disappointed. For me, I'm always disappointed by the amount of weight I can lift. Like, Jesus, I'm so weak. Like,
right.
My friend's like, oh, I can squat, 200 pounds or whatever. And I'm like, I'm squatting the bar and it hurts. And like,
right.
But
right.
everybody starts there. Like, some people are genetic freaks in nature and they're just naturally strong. I'm not. But that feeling, 2 or 3 months down the road, when you've put the squat bar up and you've got 100, 150 pounds on there and you're able to do it, like, shit, I remember when I could only squat the bar. And I think, like, generalizing that feeling to creative endeavors is important too. It's you only get better by doing the work. Some people are naturally gifted, whether they're naturally gifted athletes. There are some people who just have abs no matter what they eat, which is, screw those people. Some people are born naturally gifted in terms of painting or writing or whatever. Mm-hmm. But for most of us, we have to do the work. And again, it's just recognizing that. And as painful as it can be, if you're working on a project or whatever, you're working on writing, you're working on a painting, drawing, whatever, go back and look at the stuff that you used to do. Because I'm willing to bet it's what you're doing now is better than what you were doing before. And it may not hit your high expectations, but you can still see your own growth and realize that, like, 99% of people have to put those reps in to get to the point where their work, meets their expectations. So I don't know. It's hard. Like, I deal with, think about, imposter syndrome all the time. I hate telling people I'm a writer. I don't like explaining, because like the next question always is, well, what do you write? Like, what kind of stories do you write? And like, well, I wrote one about a guy who only thinks about soup and feet, and like,
right.
And then they just kind of like, okay, I'm sorry I asked this question. Please don't ever talk to me again. Like, but it's funny. I promise you should read it. It's good.
There's a good payoff. It's there.
It's there. Hang in. I promise.
That's hilarious.
I don't know. I think it's important to have those role models in your creative life. But I think it's also important, again, to remember, like, you're on your own path. Like, it could take you less time than somebody. It could take you more time. But as long as you keep putting in the time and the effort, you're going to get there.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because you're talking about, too, like, your piece of advice, it sounds like one of the stronger ones that I'm getting out of this is look at or read people's early work, because if you can also identify the improvements that they've made, you're more likely to be able to go back and look at your stuff and say, oh, I see where my improvement is. I see where that path has been, started. I see where I came from, and being able to identify those gaps is extremely important, because then I feel like you have the confidence to keep identifying the things you have to work on. And that's the key to that improvement, that now you're not bashing your head against the table every day. Now you're saying, oh, I go this way.
Yep.
Right. Because that's where you came from. And now you've got a better idea of where you want to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and sometimes it's hard to remember that. There are definitely days where it's just like, I'm garbage. I'm never going to be good at this. Why am I, like, I should just quit now. But then, the ideas keep coming. That's the thing about, I feel like, for me, at least, I can't speak to anybody else, but even on the days that I don't write, if I'm not writing, or if I'm like I suck, the ideas don't go away. Like, I still have, hey, this is an interesting thought, or somebody tells me a story and it's like, oh shit, I have to, like, and it sparks an idea in my mind. I have to write a story about that. Like, a story I'm working on right now came out of my friend Chuck. He lives in a retirement community. And like 3 or 4 months ago, one of his neighbors came and talked to him and was like, are you harboring Georgians in your apartment? We know you have more people in your apartment than you're supposed to. And he was like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, first of all, are you talking about people from Georgia, the country? Are you talking about people from Georgia, the state? Like, what the hell? Where is this even coming from? And the person was like, I know you have people in your apartment. And he was like, yeah, my wife and myself and my son. Like, get the hell out of here. But in my weird brain, that sparked this idea about a mathematician, so like sort of a mathematician alchemist, I guess is the best way to put it, who figures out a way to create a pocket dimension. And he creates a pocket dimension in his shitty little apartment in Prague. And then he ends up, basically, he harbors Jews in his pocket dimension to save them from the Nazis. But that came out of this story of my friend telling me that somebody was accusing him of keeping Georgians in his apartment. Like, right. So even if I didn't want to write that day, I'm like, shit, that's a cool idea. Like, I want to explore this. So I don't know. Like I said, even on those days that I'm not motivated, if I get a sentence down or I get a thought down, I can come back to it later because they just don't go away. I guess that's just how my brain works. Like, maybe I should stop letting my intrusive thoughts become stories, but it's been too much fun so far to, stop doing that.
Well, It sounds like you've built a good habit out of it too. You know what I mean? So even if you wanted to stop, that habit's already been cemented in your mind, so it's not going to stop.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, man, I appreciate all of the time you've given me. It's been a super awesome conversation. I look forward to hearing more of the podcasts on Tomorrow Isle and your work coming out, especially the postcard ones. I really like those. Those are pretty cool, man.
Well, yeah. Shoot me your address at some point. Maybe you'll get a postcard in the mail.
For sure. Again, I appreciate the time, brother.
Oh, yeah. Thanks.